Subscribe to the Survival Record if you value history not as entertainment but as instruction. Today's subject looks mundane: how people heated small cabins and field shelters during the Second World War. But it exposes a quiet failure of modern thinking. World War II forced millions of soldiers, resistance fighters, refugees, and forced laborers to survive winters with almost no fuel, no spare materials, and no margin for error. What they developed under pressure was not primitive. It was precise, adaptive, and often more efficient than what we build today. Modern construction forgot these lessons not because they stopped working, but because they stopped fitting industrial convenience. Most people assume wartime heating was crude: smoky fires, wasteful stoves, and miserable cold. But, the reality is more uncomfortable for us. In forests, mountains, and occupied countryside across Europe and Asia, people learned to heat spaces quietly, with minimal fuel, minimal detection, and minimal infrastructure. These methods were not accidents. They were responses to scarcity, surveillance, and survival. And they reveal how fragile our modern assumptions about heating really are. The war forced people to think about heat as a survival system, not just a comfort feature. It really became a matter of life and death. In peacetime architecture, heat is usually something that's added after the structure is finished. But during the war, heat actually determined the structure itself. Cabins built by partisans, forestry units, and rear echelon troops were designed specifically around how warmth would be retained, shared, and even concealed. Walls were thick, not for strength, but really for thermal mass. Openings were minimized, and interior volume was kept deliberately small because every extra cubic meter would require fuel that, might not exist tomorrow. This kind of thinking really survives today only in, rather niche survival literature. Modern homes, even in some of the coldest climates, often end up prioritizing square footage and aesthetics over real thermal logic. During World War II, cabins actually reversed that hierarchy. Heat came first, absolutely. Everything else, that was negotiable. In those days, low-profile stoves actually mattered more than, just having powerful ones. Contrary to popular belief, many World War II shelters did not rely on large iron stoves. Fuel scarcity made that impractical. Instead, compact stoves with long flue paths were favored. These allowed hot gases to travel through masonry, clay, or packed earth before exiting, transferring heat slowly into the structure. In occupied territories, smoke was as dangerous as cold. A tall plume could invite patrols or artillery. Low-output stoves reduced visible emissions and could be fed with twigs, roots, or scrap wood rather than logs. The emphasis was efficiency, not intensity. Modern heating systems, by contrast, often burn fuel rapidly and vent most of the heat outdoors. Earth was used as insulation long before it was marketed as green building. Partisan bunkers and winter cabins were frequently dug into slopes or bermed with soil. This was not camouflage alone. Earth provided stable insulation against temperature swings. Once the interior warmed, it actually stayed warm far longer than, say, a freestanding wooden hut. Interestingly, modern builders rediscovered this concept late in the 20th century and, branded it as innovation. But during the Second World War, it was simply common sense. When fuel is scarce and exposure is frankly lethal, the ground becomes an ally. The war really proved that passive thermal stability could outperform active heating under the worst conditions imaginable. Shared heat was planned deliberately, not incidentally. In civilian life, shared sleeping spaces are often seen as a loss of privacy. During the war, they were a heating strategy. Bunks were stacked closely. Sleeping platforms were raised above cold floors. People slept near stoves, not for comfort, but to reduce fuel consumption overnight. This collective approach allowed a single heat source to sustain multiple occupants. In modern housing, people are, often isolated into separate rooms, and each of those rooms needs its own heating load. But during the Second World War, survival spaces actually treated humans themselves as thermal contributors. When it came to keeping warm, thermal layering was honestly more important than just wall thickness alone. Cabins, well, they were rarely just wood and air. The walls were often layered with moss, straw, fabric, paper, or sometimes even clothing remnants. These materials trapped air and reduced heat loss far more effectively than bare timber. The exact materials varied by region, but the principle was, really universal. Modern construction often relies on uniform insulation materials installed mechanically. Wartime builders used what they had, but applied it intelligently. They understood that multiple imperfect layers could, in fact, outperform a single proper one. This improvisational mindset is honestly largely absent from standardized building codes today. The placement of entrances was treated as a heating decision. Many World War II cabins featured indirect entrances, angled corridors, low doors, or small vestibules. These were not just defensive measures. They prevented warm air from spilling out every time someone entered or exited. Modern homes often place large doors directly into living spaces, creating significant heat loss. During the war, that waste could not be tolerated. Every opening was a liability, thermally and tactically. Builders designed accordingly. Heating systems were designed to function without constant attention. Fuel scarcity meant fires could not be fed continuously. Stoves and hearths were ingeniously built to retain heat long after the fire had burned down. With clay-lined fireboxes, stone surrounds, and carefully covered embers, warmth was able to persist throughout the night. This clever design reduced both fuel use and risk. An unattended fire, well, it was dangerous, but so was the threat of freezing. World War II heating solutions aimed to minimize both of these risks. Modern systems, they assume an uninterrupted energy supply and constant regulation, a luxury that history suggests should never be taken for granted. Cabins were often built small on purpose, not because of, poor resources. The temptation in hardship is to build larger, to spread out discomfort. But actually, World War II survival builders did the opposite. Smaller spaces were easier to heat, easier to conceal, and, easier to defend. They also forced discipline in fuel usage. Today, small dwellings are marketed as lifestyle choices, but during the war, they were strategic necessities. The physics has not changed. It's really only our priorities that have shifted over time. Interestingly, moisture control was recognized as a heating issue rather than a hygiene one. Quite a different perspective, don't you think? During World War II, cabins were cleverly designed with raised floors, drainage trenches, and airflow control to keep the interiors dry. This approach made the limited heat sources much more effective, wouldn't you say? Modern buildings often rely on mechanical systems to manage humidity. Wartime shelters relied on structure and placement. They treated moisture as an enemy. equal to cold, long before building science formalized the concept. Silent heat was sometimes more important than warm heat. In occupied regions, visible smoke or excessive heat signatures could be fatal. Some shelters used underground flues that cooled exhaust before release. Others vented smoke through vegetation or snow cover to diffuse visibility. This created a trade-off between comfort and concealment. Survivors accepted lower temperatures to remain alive. Modern heating assumes safety and visibility are non-issues, but, history suggests that assumption is actually pretty fragile. Improvisation was guided by principles, not guesswork. What stands out in wartime heating is not ingenuity alone, but consistency. Across different countries and climates, similar solutions emerged. This indicates shared principles: conserve heat, minimize loss, adapt structure to environment, and plan for scarcity. Modern builders often rely on technology to compensate for poor fundamentals, but back in the day, World War II survivors had no such luxury. They built from principles first. Post-war abundance erased lessons that only scarcity can teach. After 1945, cheap fuel and industrial materials changed how buildings were designed. Understanding how World War II cabins were heated is not nostalgia. It is a reminder that comfort is contingent and resilience must be designed. These were not heroic anecdotes. They were systems tested under extreme conditions, refined by survival. If this kind of overlooked history matters to you, history that teaches rather than reassures, subscribe to the Survival Record. Share this video with others who value depth over summary and who understand that the past still has practical lessons to offer.